I don't know who. There we go. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, and so we're going to not waste any of the time that we've been given. If you recall, Joshua has sent out spies into the land, specifically to Jericho, to spy it out. They have now returned. They've brought a good report. They are ready to enter the land. In the 3 days interim of that time, Joshua has moved the people from Shittim into ready to enter the land. And so when we pick it up in chapter 3 here, this is where we are at tonight. So let's start with our memory verse. It is May. And so we have a new memory verse of the month, 2 Samuel 7:16. And so if you will, recite along with me. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So as we talk about promises, and the promises we see fulfilled throughout Scripture, and we're talking about this specifically in Joshua, this is another promise that God gave David to be fulfilled through Solomon, and that is something that we see fulfilled, and his throne did last forever, all the way to its descendant Jesus. Okay, so we are in Joshua chapter 3. Verse 1, the people here are ready to enter the land. We're not going to read most of these chapters, and so let's go ahead and first few verses in chapter 3, let's read that. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Acacia Grove and came to the Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and they lodged there before they crossed over. So it was after 3 days, and this is when the spies returned, that the officers went through the camp, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you must go, for you have not passed this way before. And Joshua said to the people, sanctify yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. So the people here are following, and they've been given some preliminary instructions. The ark is going to go in front of them, and there is going to be a space of a little over a half a mile that they need to wait before the ark goes that way. It's very significant here that the ark is leading the people in this moment. It's going to be a physical reminder of the people's covenant with God. They see the ark, it represents God, they are following him, and he is the one who is leading them into this land. This is going to be a faith point for them. If you remember, the last report they got prior to these spies returning here in chapter 2 is that the land is terrifying. And it's good, but it's not something that they can overcome. So now the people here are presented with a choice. You see the ark, you can follow after it and receive your promises, or not. Last time, the people chose not. And so now here we are 38 years later. Hopefully they will make a better choice. So God here tells them in the next several verses that when the priests carrying the ark step into the river, that's going to be in verse 13, and it shall come to pass as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap. So it was when the people set off from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, that the feet of the priest who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflowed all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still, and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zaretan. So the waters that went down into the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jordan. So here's a map that we have. This red circle here indicates the general area where the people are crossing from. You see Shittim here on the east side of the Jordan. The people have come here and standing on the east side, and the waters are stopped. And this is a real distinction point from the previous crossing, which was at the Red Sea in Exodus. In that case, you remember the water stopped, and it was like God was blowing a path through the waters, and water stood in a heap on either side. The people crossed to the middle. In this case, God stopped the waters up here near Adam, which is about 20 miles away, and they stood at a heap. You also have here some different tributaries that are coming into the river south of this point. So the waters are all stopped north of that, and the tributaries running into it. And so then the waters that were flowing continue to flow to the Dead Sea, and then the water is dry between the point here and the point here. It's a very clear distinction. This is not something that was done in secret. All the people that lived along this riverbank and were within inside of the Jordan would have seen this happen. And to stop that much water, remember here in verse, where was that? Verse 15 that we read, this was in the harvest time, this was the springtime. The rainy season had just concluded. We're talking about water that normally would have been, wide but fordable in this region, were estimated to be 100 feet wide and possibly 10 feet deep. All of that water is shoved up and stopped north. And this was a sign, and we see this, that this was going to be a sign to the people, not only the people of Israel, but the people of Canaan too, so that everybody saw and understood what was happening and that God was truly leading these people. We see here in chapter 4 that Joshua, under the instruction of God, is going to set up a memorial to remember this event. God tells them to select 12 men from all the people, one from each tribe. This is verse 2 of chapter 4. And as they're crossing, they're going to take 12 stones. And they're going to carry them to the site that night, and they're going to set up a memorial for the people to remember this event. Joshua also is going to set up, this is verse 9, an additional 12 stones that were taken out of the middle of the river where they were. And they were going to be placed where the priest stood, which was just on the edge of the east side of the Jordan, so that there was a secondary memorial on that side. It's very easy for people to forget things that happened in their past. And while something is absolutely amazing today, tomorrow some of the luster may have worn off. We may forget the significance, the importance of what it means to us, the value. And so God establishes memorials for his people so that they can remember things that happened. We see this with the Passover. We're going to talk about that a little bit later tonight. We see this with the Lord's Supper for us, so that these important things and their value and what they mean to us are always in front of us so we can remember. And so he did that as a reminder of God's providence and power, as a point so that they can teach their children. This is something that's highlighted here in verse 21. When your children ask your fathers in time to come, what are these stones? That you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry land. As a memorial for the people, as God brings them into the promised land, and that God was fulfilling his promises to them. And then also said that all peoples of the earth will know that the hand of the Lord. Like we talked about, this was not something that was done in secret. This was open in front of all of Canaan so that they could see it. It was a huge event. That water was piled up miles upstream. Everybody saw it. Everybody was talking about it. We see in chapter 5, verse 1, so it was when the king of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel, until we had crossed over, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. This is part of God's purpose. He's putting the fear into these people. Their judgment is coming, and it is not coming in secret. It was coming, and they were going to be destroyed because of their wickedness. And so they could see that and realize that what was happening. This kind of is a continuation of what we talked about last week a little bit, and the response of the Canaanites and the reaction to the people of Israel, and Rahab's reaction as well. And so I put, let's talk about this very, very briefly. So this is a closer map. They're crossing over here from the plains of Moab into Jericho. This is Gilgal here. This is the camp that they established. There is another Gilgal a little bit further north, about 8 miles north of this location. This is a city that was going to be captured by Joshua. This is the city where Elisha and Elisha started out in their journey to when Elisha was going to be taken up on the other side of the Jordan. The facts of the description that we're given here in this chapter, in chapter 4, describe it as being east of the Jordan, and that's east of Jericho, and that's in verse 19. And so the description is something that's closely to the east side. Josephus describes it as being about 2 miles outside the city of Jericho. And so this is the people in camp. And so you've had the river back up upstream. People are terrified of that. Then Jericho's watching, and they can see this mass of people come in and encamp on their front porch. And they are terrified. And in verse 6, we see that they were shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. They're not taking any chances. This multitude that the people are terrified of is here, and they're coming. And they don't know when the hammer's going to fall on them, but they know it's coming. And so we see this response of the people here, that they are terrified, they're faint-hearted, their hearts melted, there is no courage left. But the response of the people to the power of God, of the Canaanites, resulted in them fighting against God. They were scared. They wouldn't do anything about it. They weren't going to turn to God. They weren't going to have the proper response. Compared to Rahab, where she saw the same things, but she turned to God and sought his mercy and grace and obeyed him and received his salvation. The response of the Canaanites is very, very similar to the response of the 10 tribes. The 10 spies. There was terror. There was faint-heartedness. They were scared of the people of the land. And so they were rejected by God. They rejected him. And that resulted in their failure to enter the land. We see here two very different responses. The original people that came out of Egypt and the Canaanites were scared. And they failed to follow God because of their fears. Rahab respected God. She feared him. She feared his power. But it prompted her to turn towards him. The Israelites here in chapter 4, in verse 14, on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. The Israelites who were crossing over were equally shocked. Most of them had not seen anything like this before. But their fear did not result in them rejecting God like the spies did. Their fear prompted them to follow God, to obey God, and obey his appointed leader Joshua. And so they received their promise. Rahab received her promise of salvation. The Israelites received their promise to enter the land because of their response to what they see and what they observed. So, any questions or thoughts on chapters 3 and 4 before we go into chapter 5? Okay, let's go into chapter 5. So, we've been looking at the military preparation. There's a physical military invasion of the land here that we've been reading about. They send out spies to figure out what's going on. They cross over and they invade the territory that they're going to take. But that's not all they have to do. This is a spiritual battle above anything else. And if they failed to follow God, they would not receive that land. They need to be spiritually ready. And so there's some things they have to do first before God is going to allow them to come against the Canaanites. And so this is going to start in verse 2 of chapter 5. So let's go ahead and read that. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourselves, and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." So Joshua made flint knives for himself, and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way, after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, and all the people born in the wilderness, on the way as they came out of Egypt, had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people who were men of war, who came out of Egypt, were consumed, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised on the way. So it was, when they were finished circumcising all the people, that they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore, the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day." So, what does circumcision mean? What's the significance of this ordinance that God wants his people to undergo?
It's a sign of the covenant that God established between himself and his chosen people.
Yes, it's a sign of the covenant between God and his people. When was it first established? Genesis what? Yes, Genesis 17. It was given to Abraham as a sign of the covenant between Abraham and God. And this was the three promises, the land, seed, and nation promise that he gave. And that was a covenant or a sign of that promise between the two of them. This was going to be passed down to all of Abraham's male descendants on the 8th day of life. And this was what God told him to do in Genesis 17. And so it was done to Isaac. It was done to Ishmael, even though Ishmael was older at this point. And it was done to all of their descendants, continuing on to the point to where they were still doing it in the land of Egypt. Failure to do so would result in being cut off from Abraham's people. Do y'all remember in Exodus where Moses is on his way back to the land of Egypt to deliver the people, and he encounters the Lord's angel, I believe it was, who was upset. He had deserved wrath because he had failed to circumcise his own son. Failure to circumcise and respect that covenant between God's physical nation, the Israelites, and himself was deserving of God's wrath. It would result in rejection of his promises and rejection by God of his people. And so it was really important that that was going to be reinforced in the law of Moses in Leviticus 12, that they would continue to do that. But we see they didn't do that on the way. Why?
They wouldn't be marching very much.
They would not be marching very far. You're right. There were a lot of people being born. The numbers that I looked at, so in Numbers 26, the census describes 601,370 Israelite males over the age of 20. So between 20 and 60 years of age, right? Because everyone under 20 died out. So 59, 60-ish was the oldest people aside from Joshua and Caleb. And this was only from the 11 tribes. The Levites were not numbered in that initial number. There were 23,000 Levites that were numbered over the 1 month of age. So we're talking about 750,000 males that were not circumcised. Okay. Now, some of the people who were under 20 years of age were circumcised in Egypt and were included in this number. Likewise, there were others that were under 20 that were not counted in this census that also wouldn't have been circumcised. To Hugh's point, to circumcise that many people along the way, they're not going to be moving very far. It would take a lot of time to do all that, and God had business that he wanted them going about and doing. So there seems to be a reason. We don't see God turning on the people during these 38 years where they're wandering. There's no evidence of the wrath coming upon them, and because they were not circumcised in the way it came upon Moses in Exodus. And so there's some indication, to me at least, that God was aware and understanding and waived this at this point during these 38 years, 40 years of wandering. But now the people are done wandering, and they're ready to enter the land, and that covenant relationship needs to be reestablished, and that ordinance needs to be reestablished. And so here, Joshua is called to circumcise everybody that hadn't been circumcised up to this point, which is a lot of people. Okay. Thankfully, circumcision is not a requirement under the law of Christ. But it's been replaced, right? Because we need to be circumcised by the heart. We need to put off our old man. We need to put on our new man. We need to cut out those things in our lives that are keeping us from following God. The covenant relationship between us and God today is just as important as it was to God back then, under the law of Moses. And so he took this very, very seriously, that when he's leading them into battle, they are properly prepared. And when he's leading us into our spiritual battles today, we also need to be properly prepared. We need to be sanctified. We need to have those, the right mindset and the preparation and the circumcision of our own hearts every time he leads us. Or we're going to be in danger of rejection as well. Thoughts or comments? Okay. So our next question, what does Joshua 5:6 reveal about the promises of God? We passed over this one already. The people had not been circumcised on the way. I put this verse on the board for us. Also, you can read along. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. Promise number 1, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land, which, promise number 2, the Lord had sworn to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So what does this verse reveal about God's promises? They're conditional. In what way? How so? Okay. Tim? Okay. Which ones? Because there's 2 here.
It's like the blessings and curses. If you do what you're supposed to do, you'll be blessed, and not to be cursed. And their lives being taken during that time is part of the curse of not following him during the wilderness.
Yes. His promises are always, every single time fulfilled. But whether they're going to be fulfilled for us is conditional on whether we follow Christ. For him, did the fact that the Israelites rejected the promise in Numbers 13 and 14 result in the promise not being fulfilled? No. That promise was still fulfilled. It wasn't fulfilled for them, but it still came to pass. One generation's unbelief, however, to Dorothy's point, resulted in their lack of receiving that promise for them. Their next generation, their children got it. It was still fulfilled, but they didn't get to enjoy the promises of that. So when we think about our promise and our promised land that awaits us, what are some applications we can take from this point?
God knows who his people are. He always has. So obviously, in some ways, by either just life situations or just living in this world, we have to put up with consequences of either our sins or other people's sins. But God will always, at the end of the day, fulfill his promises to those that obey him. And he knows exactly who's doing what to that.
Yeah, he knows who his people are. And he's always going to take care of them, protect them, and bring them into the land. Absolutely. Stephen?
Even though it seems far off sometimes, heaven is just as real as the land of Canaan was to these people right here. It's right before their eyes. It's gonna happen. It's there. It's real. So not just the fulfillment of that, but everything he's promised it's just the way he said it is.
Yeah, he never lies. He never backtrack on his word. If he says he's going to give it to us, he's going to give it to us. It needs to be real to us, as if we can physically see it and know it's there.
I can't remember the exact book, chapter, verse, but I am reminded by this, I believe it's a verse in the Bible where it said that if we turn our backs on God, he turns his back on us.
Yeah.
That's what I'm taking away for this, and that's exactly what he did. Those who were consumed by the wilderness, they turned their backs on God's commands, so he left them to their fate. He didn't abandon them, they abandoned him.
Yes, God is here. He is here and ready to give those promises to anybody that's going to latch on to him. The problem in Numbers 13 and 14 is that they failed to latch on. They abandoned and let go and wandered off. And so he let them wander for 40 years until It was time to fulfill the promise in his time, right? And I think that's another point here too. It's not up to us to determine when God's moment to fulfill this promise to us is. God's going to fulfill it to us. Our only responsibility is to follow him and trust that he's going to do it. And when his time is right, we will receive what he's promised us. Anybody else? Okay. I think Hebrews 3 has a lot to say about this, and I do want to flip over there momentarily. Hebrews 3 and verse 7. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit said, today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the days of the trial of the wilderness, where your fathers tested me and tried me and saw my works 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they will not enter my rest. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. So this promise and this example here of the people's failure to believe and trust in God's promises resulted in them not entering the rest. We have a rest. We need to be diligent, to Miles's point, to pursue it, trust it, latch on to God, and follow it, because he knows who his people are. And if we are not being diligent to enter that rest ourselves, we're going to miss it. Just like the people in Numbers 13 and 14 missed it too. We've got to, in chapter 4 here, follow the word of God. It's verse 12, for the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit and of joints and marrow, and the discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. We need to hold on to God's word, realize the power in it, and that it will fight for us if we are willing to put it into application. We need to be diligent to do so, because our willingness to follow God or not is going to result in us receiving the promise or not. The promise is going to be fulfilled for those who follow him. We need to be sure that we're on the right side of that too. Okay. What's the significance of circumcising the men here at Gilgal? And kind of to let you know what I was thinking, I gave you some passages in Genesis. In Genesis 34. Who can summarize the story that happens in Genesis 34?
Dinah was basically raised by Shechem. He was the prince of the country, and he took her by force, but he wanted to keep her, and so all the Israelites made a pact. Y'all are all circumcised, won't intermarry, and all that kind of stuff. So they did. The men were weak, and they slaughtered them.
Yes. So there was a danger here to the people of the land. They circumcised all the people, and 3 days later, when they were still healing, Levi and Simeon went in and wiped them all out. A couple of guys, maybe they had a couple of buddies with them, went and destroyed everybody because they were in a weakened state. So here we are, and here's this map again. We are a couple of miles just east of Jericho. Jericho can see them. There's this huge black blob of all these Israelites out here camped. And now we are being told to circumcise them, and all the men of war here are now in a weakened state. So what's the significance of doing it here?
Given that context, it's significant because it shows faith in God, that he'll watch over them, keep them safe, and keep the fear of him within the hearts of the Jericho people, in the sense that they may be in a weakened state, but the God they serve can still be able to completely incinerate us should we even try anything. So let's play our cards as safe as possible here. maybe we can get lucky. Try to speak for the minds of the Jericho people.
It requires trust in God. He has promised them victory. He has promised them, chapter 1, verse 5, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. This is a promise to Joshua here. That includes regardless of the state of the people and of the people who can fight those battles. And so they are in a weakened state here. It would have not been difficult for Jericho, if you pull God out of the picture, for Jericho to come and wipe out these Israelites in this moment. They would have never had a chance to take over the land because the men wouldn't be able to fight back. It requires trust on Joshua, and it requires trust on the part of the people to say, no, God is calling us to do this. We're going to do this thing now. Regardless of the military foolishness that this might have taken if you were looking at it from a worldly perspective. Comments? Okay. Let's go on. Let's go ahead and look at verse 10 of chapter 5. And we're going to read 10, 11, and 12 here. Now the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. And they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and the parched grain on the same day. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land. And the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. So, chapter 4, and in verse, we skipped over this earlier. Verse 19, now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped at Gilgal on the east side of the border of Jericho. So, they've been in the land 4 days at this point. On the 10th day, they crossed over. If you look in Exodus, on the 10th day, that's the day they were supposed to select the lamb that they were going to sacrifice and eat of during the Passover. So that would have been done that day. Then somewhere in those few days, those 4 days interim, they're circumcised. And now we are here on the 14th day of the month at twilight celebrating Passover. What's the purpose of partaking Passover?
A reminder of how God or one of his angelic agents passed over them while he was smiting the firstborn of the Egyptians, and how they more or less barely got out of that by the skin of their teeth thanks to the lamb's blood on the linen doorpost.
So it's remembering the 10th plague, and when God delivered them, as he promised, he would pass over them if they painted the blood on the door, and he fulfilled his promise there. Good? What else?
It's also, so we saw the circumcision takes them back to the promises made to Abraham, that he would inherit the land and have become a great nation. Now we're going back to what God had done with Moses in bringing him out of Egypt, and then ultimately to Sinai and giving them the law and the promises reiterated there.
Yeah, so we're kind of in these 4 days going over their history a little bit. Remember who you are. Remember where you come from. Remember your promises and the promises that I've given you, and you have seen them come to pass at this point. I see another hand over here. No? Okay, so it memorialized the people's deliverance from Egypt. That's what JD was talking about. This was given by Moses to the people here in Exodus 12 as they're preparing for the 10th plague. Moses is telling them, it's time to go. Get ready. We're going to have this Passover celebration. Remember, they're supposed to eat with their sandals on, their staff in their hand. They had specific things they were supposed to eat, unleavened bread, the lamb. None of it was to last until the next day. Anything that was left over needed to be burned, and they needed to be ready to go. It was supposed to be a reminder of God's providence and power. The promises were being fulfilled. God promised that he was going to bring them out of the bondage of land of Egypt, and he did so by his power over every single cultural and religious aspect of Egypt. and over everything else, over life and death. He brought them out of the land. And so they needed to look back and they need to remember that event. It was a reminder to serve God and obey him. He promised to save them from death. And so that was part of what they needed to be looking on and obey him in response to that power. This, again, was a teaching point for the children. We just talked about this with the stones that they set up in Gilgal. This was another thing. These reminders are moments in time where we can look back and talk to our kids about God and what he does for us. And this is the same thing as the Passover here. Interesting enough, how many years had it been since the first Passover was celebrated? 40 years. The first one was celebrated in Egypt as they were getting ready to go on this journey to the Promised Land. And now here they are 40 years later in the Promised Land, celebrating this first Passover before God, ready to go, ready to take the land. And so I find this to be symbolic and special and a unique Passover in a way that maybe they hadn't celebrated since the first one. And so it's just makes, in my mind, if I have been there and trying to put myself in their shoes, the reminder of God's providence and power. Yes, I'm looking back to an event that I may or may not have been alive for, but here I'm standing in the land that he promised to give us. And this providence and power and the promises fulfilled are much more real for them in this moment. It's just an interesting thing to think about. What happened over the next couple of days after the Passover? What did the people do?
They ate of the fruits of the land of Canaan, and the manna ceased, mostly because they didn't eat it anymore.
Right. So they ate from the produce of the land, verses 11 and 12. Ate of the produce of the land the day after the Passover. This was the promise. Remember, it wasn't just the land, it was the bountiful harvest of the land too. And what time of year did they enter the land? It's harvest time. God's time is perfect in all ways. And so he brings them into this land that is overflowing with food for these people. The rains have ceased, and there's lots of good things for them, and the manna ceased. Because to JD's point, they didn't need it anymore. God had provided them manna in the wilderness. Why? He had to. There was nothing else out there, right? So he provided their daily sustenance. He's brought them into the land of Canaan. Does that mean he's not providing for them anymore, though? No. He's just providing for them in a different way. He's providing them through his promises that are now being fulfilled. So the manna ceased, and they no longer ate of it after that day because they were in the land of Canaan. What did this ceasing of the manna symbolize?
The end of the wilderness.
The end of the wilderness and the end of the wanderings. They were there. They were where God had promised to bring them. So they were beginning to enjoy the gifts that he had promising them for years at this point, centuries since the days of Abraham. It didn't mean, like I said, that God was not providing for them, but now he is providing for them in a typical way where they could eat from the land. We need to be really, really careful to not just look for God's providence and provisions in moments of great circumstances, like being saved from a tornado, or we're driving down the highway and there's a wreck that goes right by us in front of us, and we're like, wow, God saved us from this. And seeing his providence in those moments. He also provides for us on the daily when we are provided with our jobs and we're provided with safety getting everywhere that we're going, and we have food on our table and we have clean water and we have comforts in our lives.
Well, and back to Stephen's point from earlier about the reality of heaven, if we're taken such good care of here, then I can't imagine how just perfect and luxurious and incredible heaven's going to be.
Yeah, you compare, to your point, you compare manna, which is described as being sweet and, good, and they ate it for 40 years every single day. And then they get into the land And the provision that it provides is far and above the manna and what it gave them in terms of sustenance. In our lives here, we are comfortable in a lot of ways, and we're very, very blessed. But the blessings we're going to receive when we cross over ourselves are going to be so much more and above. Lori?
I was just thinking what a drastic changes was, it's 2 simple verses, but huge change in their lives, because this is all the food that they knew. They didn't have, everybody had died out except for Joshua. They didn't have the complaints of, the food, the leaks in Egypt and all that. This is all they knew, and their world just opened drastically daily.
Yeah, putting ourselves in their shoes, can you imagine going from manna to all of this laid out in front of you that you can see, and you can just go and get it because it's there. God provides in amazing ways.
It's not just the food. As they continued through the conquest, they overtook cities that were already built, houses that were already built, fields that were already, taken care of, the livestock. Roads already built. These were fully formed civilizations that they just walked in and took over.
Yes, that's the miraculous part of what God provides. God provides in amazing, miraculous ways, and He also provides in typical ways too for all of us. All of our gifts come from Him, and we need to be careful not to thank Him for all of them, instead of just the amazing things that pop up to us in moments of amazement.
This just has me thinking about this is part of the reason why I really enjoy when we have our review of missionaries in foreign lands. It's always man, it really humbles me. It steps on my toes. And I was complaining about this the other day, and they're just happy to have bread, or just happy to be with one another under something a tent with no air conditioning, and we complain about it's hot here. You know what I mean? It really puts in perspective, to the point that was made earlier, this is all they knew. They knew manna. So when they grow up with manna, and then they go to Canaan, they have the fruits and the vegetables, and they're whoa, this is so good. There's so much more appreciation. I kind of think we are kind of numb to that in America. We're so blessed that when we forget, like you're saying, to count those blessings, those everyday average things that we take for granted, that we just kind of don't see the weight of how blessed we are here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've had several of those recently, and it's a really good reminder, that we're all shooting for the same reward, right, and the same promised land that's going to be amazing for all of us. And it doesn't matter the state that we live here. God's providing for all of us in some ways differently, but we're all being provided for. Okay, let's finish out the chapter, verse 13. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? So he said, No, but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him, and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. Okay, so here Joshua is now standing on a hill surveying Jericho. Jericho is shut up. We talked about that in chapter 6 and verse 1. They're terrified. He's out looking at the first place they're going to conquer. And this man appears before him. Okay? He has a sword in his hand, and he identifies himself as the commander of the Lord's army. Who is this person?
An angel of the Lord.
Okay, an angel. Anybody have anything to say else? Stephen?
I'm not sure, but the part that gives me pause is he was accepting of worship.
Correct.
So it just leads me to believe that it might not just be an angel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Angels are not recipients of worship, or they should not be. And if they were a commander of the Lord's army as an angel and had received worship and accepted it, they would have not been commander of the Lord's army anymore, right? But we continue into chapter 6, and we hear about the message that this commander gives. And so I agree. I think this is something different, whether this was God manifested. We've seen God manifested in human form in Genesis 18 and some other places when he comes and meets Abraham and Moses. And so I think this is just a continuation of that. Again, we don't have anything else to support that other than a couple of things here. Hugh.
He responded the same way that the voice did from the burning bush.
Uh-huh.
Exodus 3.
Correct. So, and we're identified there as the burning bush as the Lord. And so there's no reason to think that this is not the same, just a different manifestation. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for your comments. We will pick it up here in chapter 6 with our next lesson next week.